Herzlich willkommen. Herzlich willkommen allen zum heutigen Abendvortrag von Arash Naraghi. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome Arash Naraghi to our School of Theology in Reutlingen. We already had the pleasure of welcoming him yesterday for a study day. Today he will give this evening lecture as part of a seminar on health and healing from an intercultural perspective. So far, we have discovered and analyzed various phenomena in the Christian context. Tonight, we would like to broaden our religious perspective with a lecture by Dr. Naraghi. Questions of health and healing are, of course, universal questions, and they play an important role to many or all religious traditions. Dr. Naraghi will share his impressive expertise on the Islamic tradition with us. He was born in Tehran, although as a young person he became interested in moral philosophy. He first studied pharmacy and earned a doctorate in that field at the University of Tehran. Later, he moved to the United States to follow his passion for philosophy on religious topics. He earned a second PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he's currently professor of philosophy and religion at Moravian University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. His interest in religion started when he was very young, apparently shaped by the growing dominance of Islamic discourse in post-revolutionary Iran. In his work, Naraghi explores how modern life and religion can go together. In his work, Naraghi on the one hand, he writes about human rights and justice. He believes that these values are essential for peaceful life in today's society, including Islamic ones. Building on this ethical framework, Dr. Naraghi addresses controversial topics such as violence, humanitarian intervention, tolerance, and homosexuality. In all these areas, his goal is to develop positions that are consistent with human rights and grounded in the principle of justice. We gained insight into his thoughts during yesterday's study day. On the other hand, he is inspired by mystical Islam, especially the work of Rumi, the Sufi poet. In one of his books, The Mirror of the Soul, he reflects on mystical experiences and inner life. And with this in mind, we now come to the topic of today's lecture, the healing power of prayer in Islamic perspective. Thank you that you are here.
Thank you very much for the very beautiful introduction, and I'm quite honored and humbled for this invitation and the opportunity you offered me coming here and meeting faculty and brilliant students I met yesterday. And it created, a very fruitful, on my part, conversation with the students. And I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to hear more about your perspectives. But today, of course, I'm going to talk about one of the central topics in major theistic religions, and probably in religion in general, and that is the matter of prayer, which plays a very central role in religious life. And when we say it has a power of healing, of course, the concept of healing should be understood in so many different levels. Sometimes it is internal healing, sometimes it means external healings. But in the context of today's conversation, I'm hoping to bring some of the insights presented by Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, a great Muslim mystic who lived not very far from here in Konya, Turkey, and he inspired, many Muslims throughout the history and in different places of the world, and non-Muslim spirituals as well. So let's begin. In Nahj al-Balagha, one of the authoritative religious texts in Islam, Imam Ali employs a very insightful medical metaphor to describe the Prophet Muhammad. Quote, "He was like a roaming physician who had prepared his remedies and heeded his instrument, applying them where needed, to cure blind hearts, deaf ears, and dumb tongues. With his medicine, he targeted the loci of heedlessness and the abscesses of perplexity." End of the quote. This imagery finds explicit collaboration in Al-Ghazali, who in one of his books, Al-Munqazu min az-Zilal, he says, quote, "In essence, the prophets, peace be upon them, are physicians for the diseases of the heart." End of the quote. This metaphor carries two axiomatic principles. First, humanity inherently suffers from a kind of spiritual pathology. And secondly, the prophets, they possess its definite remedy, cure. So, but the question is, what are these diseases of the heart they are referring to? Rumi, in his masterpiece Masnavi, identifies the mother of diseases and offers a cure for it. From his perspective, the mother of all diseases of the heart is pride and vainglory, and the cure is love. In the beginning of Masnavi, he says, quote, "Hail, O love, that brings us good gain. You are the physician of all our ills, the remedy of our pride and vainglory, our Play-Doh and Galen." End of the quote. Classical Sufi thinkers like Al-Ghazali and Rumi identify egoism as the fundamental ailment of the human condition. The unenlightened soul, constrained by its innate haughtiness, perceives itself as the ontological center of the existence, where the here, the spatial existence, and now the temporal awareness are inherently indexed to the individual self. All phenomena are thus interpreted through this solipsistic of self-referentiality. But how does love cure our egoism and self-centeredness, this mother of all the diseases of the heart? Love facilitates a radical ontological reorientation. The lover's consciousness undergoes a Copernican revolution, shifting its existential center from the I, the lover, to the thou, the beloved. This metamorphosis mirrors the Sufi's path, wherein the annihilation of ego precedes union with the divine. The transformation is encapsulated in a very famous Sufi axiom, which says, "The distance between the creation and the creator is 2 steps. One step upon the ego, yourself, the second step toward God, the creator." The therapeutic efficacy of love lies precisely in its capacity to dethrone the tyrannical self from its imagined sovereignty, thereby actualizing the prophetic imperative, which is famously says, die before you die. That is a motto quite familiar and famous among Sufis. Die before you die. But the question is, how can one cultivate a loving bond with God to go through this transformation? For many Muslim mystics, the primary means of attaining an intimate, loving connection with God is through the practice of ritual prayer. To appreciate the significance of prayer, it is essential to situate it within a broader framework of divine-human relationship as articulated in the Quran. 4 principal types of relationship between God and humans in the Quran are identified. The first one, you may call it the ontological relationship. In this framework, God is the creator of all existence, while everything besides God, including human beings, is a part of the creation. The bond between God and humanity in this context is characterized as causal bond in the act of creation. The second is the Lord-servant relationship. Here, God is the sovereign lawgiver, and human beings assume the role of obedient servants. The connection in this dynamic is defined as a duty bond relationship, emphasizing submission and adherence to divine commandments. The third one is the ethical relationship. In this dimension, God functions as a moral agent who evaluates human actions, dispensing justice and mercy in accordance with divine wisdom. And finally, and for the purpose of this discussion, the most important one is the communicative relationship. This mode involves God employing a system of symbols, both verbal and non-verbal, to convey meaning to humanity. Non-verbal communication entails the use of extra-linguistic signs, whether psychological, for example, an unexpected sense of inner peace interpreted as divine forgiveness, or natural, for example, a flood understood as an expression of divine wrath. Verbal communication involves linguistic symbols. When God initiates this kind of verbal communication, it is termed wahy, or revelation. And when humans initiate this kind of verbal communication, it is called dua or prayer. So you can see in this context, there is a close connection between dua, prayer, and revelation. Revelation by nature, in nature, more or less it's kind of verbal communication between these two sides. But if it starts from God, it is called wahy. And if humans initiate the relationship, it is called dua or prayer. Verbal communication occupies a central position in theistic religions. A very good example of this dynamic is found in the account of Moses in the sacred valley of Towa. This narrative has 2 distinct yet interconnected segments. The first segment exemplifies wahy, a unilateral, authoritative, divine address to Moses. And the second segment illustrates dua, an intimate dialogical exchange between God and his servants. So, in the first segment, you can see a monologic revelation when God assumes the role of a sovereign speaker. And I want to read this short passage from the Quran that, describes this moment. Quote, "When he," that is Moses, "saw a fire, he said to his family, 'You wait here. I observe a fire.' Perhaps I shall bring you a brand from it, or I shall find at the fire guidance. When he came to it, a voice cried, Moses, I am your God. I am your Lord. Put off your shoes. You are in the holy valley of Towah. I myself have chosen you. Therefore, give your ear to this revelation. Verily, I am God. There is no God but I. Therefore, serve me and perform the prayer of my remembrance. The hour is coming. End of the quote. Here, God delivers a universal message central to monotheistic faith, the affirmation of divine oneness, or Tawhid, and the inevitability of the day of judgment. The communication is hierarchical, emphasizing God's transcendence and human submission. You can see, it comes from top to the bottom. But the second segment shifts to a conversational mode, marked by divine inquiry and human response. Quote, what is that, Moses, you have in your right hand? The question posed by God. Why, it is my staff, said Moses. I lean upon it, and with it I beat down leaves to feed my sheep. Other uses also I find in it. That's Moses' response. End of the quote. For certain Sufi thinkers, this exchange carries profound significance. Two key observations arise. First, as an omniscient being, God undoubtedly knew well what Moses held in his right hand. Why then did he pose the question? Secondly, the very simple answer on Moses' part, the staff, would have sufficed. Yet Moses extends his reply, detailing the staff's mundane uses, despite not being explicitly asked. Some Sufi interpreters argue that this moment signifies a divine invitation to informal, affectionate discourse. Having concluded matters of theological gravity, God transitions into a tender, almost playful exchange, akin to a beloved prompting a lover to prolong their conversation. The rigid Lord-servant dynamic thus transforms into an intimate friend-to-friend or lover-to-beloved relationship, illustrating the potential for devotional closeness within the framework of submission. So here you can see the element of prayer becomes the sign of intimacy between human and God. Rumi draws a fundamental distinction between the external form and inner reality of prayer. He characterizes the outward manifestation of prayer as consisting of verbal utterances and physical rituals, while identifying its essence core as an intense devotional state, what he metaphorically describes as burning or passionate longing. This conceptual framework is articulated in the Masnavi, where Rumi employs a divine voice to address Moses, illustrating this principle. Quote from Masnavi. This is God who says these words, according to Rumi. How much more of these phrases and concepts and metaphors I, that is God, want burning. Become friendly with that burning. Light up a fire of love in your soul. Burn thoughts and expression entirely away. O Moses, they that know the conventions are of one sort, they those whose souls and spirits burn are of another sort. Rumi, end of the quote. Rumi identifies three major types of prayer in his Masnavi. First is the petitionary prayer, the other one is love prayer, and the last one is the prayer of the annihilated state. And I would like to briefly, explain Rumi's, point on each. The petitionary prayer represents a need-centered verbal communication between man and God. The petitioner calls upon God, asking him to bring about a state of affairs that fulfill his need. In response, God's action alters the course of events in the external world. The resulting change, which aligns with the petitioner's request, is understood as God's response to his prayer. Thus, within this framework, God's response is not confined to the petitioner's internal experience. While it may indeed bring about a spiritual transformation, its scope extends beyond the subjective realm, producing tangible effects within the external world. In a sense, through petitionary prayer, the petitioner initiates a process intended to influence the divine will, thereby redirecting the course of events toward the fulfillment of his need. Petitionary prayer rests upon three fundamental metaphysical presumptions. First, an open universe. The cosmos is not strictly deterministic. The combination of the past and the laws of nature does not necessitate a single inevitable future. Within this framework, God retains the capacity to intervene and alter future events, even while upholding the same natural laws and historical antecedents. The second is divine personhood. Though God may not be a person in the anthropomorphic sense, he is nevertheless personal, possessing essential attributes of personhood such as volition, intellect, moral agency, knowledge, and power. And finally, divine human communication. Crucially, the theistic conception of God presupposes his capacity to engage in verbal communication with human beings, a capacity that he is believed to exercise in accordance with his will. The immediate benefit of petitionary prayer lies in the fulfillment of the petitioner's need, provided that God grants the prayer. However, Rumi posits more profound spiritual merits in this practice. He emphasizes that through supplication and submission to divine will, humans cultivate a deeper connection with the divine. Rumi further suggests that human needs often function as divine gifts. They serve as a catalyst for a spiritual orientation toward God. Paradoxically, he warns that those who never encounter adversity should regard this uninterrupted comfort as a potential spiritual deprivation, an indication perhaps of divine disfavor in withholding opportunities for sacred proximity. To illustrate this point, Rumi used the example of Pharaoh, who reportedly never suffered even minor ailment like a headache throughout his life. Consequently, Pharaoh never sought divine assistance through prayer. In Rumi's theological framework, this constitutes divine deprivation rather than blessing, for God, in his benevolence, responds to those who cry out to him. The absence of suffering removed Pharaoh's opportunity to develop a spiritual dependence on the divine. I quoted, Rumi's words here, but I skip here. I refer you to the writing you have at your hands. Given God's omnibenevolent and omnipotent, but there is a question. How can we explain instances of apparently unanswered petitions? We pray a lot to God, but sometimes we see it's not that our prayers, granted. And the question is why? If God is all-powerful and all-good, why some of those prayers remains unanswered? Rumi addresses this theological dilemma through several interrelated justifications. Reason 1. The primary and most evident justification stems from human epistemic limitations. Petitioners often lack complete awareness of the potential consequences of their supplications. While they may assume the requested outcome would benefit them, these very requests could ultimately prove detrimental. This cognitive limitation, the inability to foresee potential harms in the future, renders the petitions misguided. Consequently, God's refusal to grant such requests manifests not a neglect, but as an expression of divine benevolence and providential care. Rumi illustrates this point through a parable. He says, a thief steals an apparently valuable snake from a snake catcher, considering it as a gain, while the snake catcher laments his loss. The snake catcher persistently petitions God for the return of his snake. Only later does he discover that treasure, or what he assumed to be a treasure, was in fact a venomous serpent that killed the thief. This revelation transforms his perception of what initially seemed like divine neglect into recognition of God's protective wisdom. And he found it a reason to be grateful to God for rejecting his prayer. So Rumi says at the end of this story, from the voicing that, snake catcher, thanks to God, that prayer was rejected. I thought it was lost, but it has turned out to be gain. Many of the prayers which are loss and destruction, and many prayers are loss and destruction, and from kindness the holy God is not hearing them. End of the quote. Second reason, Rumi posits that immediate fulfillment of petitions may engender a spiritual amnesia in the petitioner. While in a state of need, the individual maintains a Godward orientation. However, upon receiving the desired favor, there emerges a propensity toward the spiritual complacency and a return to pre-petition forgetfulness. Consequently, divine compassion may manifest through delayed response, a pedagogical withholding that prolongs the petitioner's state of devotional awareness and sustains the sacred connection forged through need. So, quote, if I satisfy his need, this is God's voice, if I satisfy his needs, he will go back and again becomes absorbed in that idle play, ordinary life, everyday mundane life. Reason 3. Rumi suggests that divine response may be deliberately delayed to prolong the soulful interiorities of the petitioner. In this mystical framework, authentic prayer constitutes a sacred love song, the most exquisite melody to the divine ear, when uttered from the depth of a sincere heart. Rumi employs an evocative metaphor to illustrate this point. Just as humans cage nightingales for their melodious songs, but never crows for their harsh cries, so too does God cherish and prolong the spiritual communion manifested through heartfelt supplication. Quote, parrots and nightingales are put into cages because they give pleasure by their sweet songs. But how should crows and owls be caged? This has never been recorded in the story. And finally, Rumi identifies a fundamental misunderstanding regarding granting a prayer. Petitioners often fail to recognize that the very capacity to supplicate constitutes the divine response. He illustrates this through a parable. He says, Rumi, a devout worshipper, after years of seemingly unanswered prayer, encountered Satan, who mocked his persistence. Discouraged, the man ceased his supplications, stopped praying. That night, a mythical figure, Khidr, appears in his dream, inquiring about his abandonment of prayer. When the man laments his unanswered petitions, Khidr, speaking with Rumi's voice, reveals a very profound truth. Quote, he, Khidr, said, God said that Allah of yours is my here I am. So when you say God and you call upon me, the mere fact that you have this tenderness in your soul to pray to God, the very same capacity is the favor from God and a response to your prayer. So that Allah of yours is my here I am. And that supplication and grief of yours is my messenger to you. You shifts and attempts to find a means of gaining access to me, where in reality, my drawing you to me. The mere fact that you are approaching me, this is actually me who are pulling you toward myself. Your fear and love are the noose to catch my favor. Beneath every O Lord of yours is many a here I am from me. End of the quote. Rumi acknowledges that while divine permission allows humans to petition for worldly needs, he considers such requests a missed spiritual opportunity. In his view, authentic prayer transcends material supplication, serving instead as a vehicle for divine communion. The most efficacious prayer, according to Rumi, are those that elevate the petitioner beyond temporal desires to establish an enduring love bond with the divine. While petitionary prayers originates in worldly desire, Rumi conceives of it as possessing an inherent transformative capacity. Such supplications, when properly oriented, can facilitate a spiritual elevation, transcending its initial mundane objectives to become a means of direct communion with the divine. This metamorphosis reflects prayer's fundamental purpose: to redirect human consciousness from temporal needs to central connection. He illustrates this principle through some metaphors. Quote, I, in this context, means the person who prayed, that represent that person. I came all the way to this place for the sake of dinar. Dinar means money. I came all the way to this place for the sake of dinar. As soon as I arrived, I became drunken with sight, with the beauty. A person ran to the baker for bread. On seeing the beauty of the baker, he gave up the ghost. A certain man went to the rose garden to take his pleasure and found it in the beauty of the gardener. Like the desert Arab who drew water from the well and tasted the water of life from the lovely face of Joseph. Moses went to fetch fire. He beheld such a fire, the burning bush, that, he escaped from fire, hellfire. Jesus sprang up to escape from his enemies. That spring carried him to the fourth heaven. So in this context, as you can see, he says, we ask God for mundane things. But when you create that connection with God, you forget your needs and become mesmerized by the beauty of the God. So in this way, your need is a nous, is a vehicle to transfer you from these mundane worldly needs to communion with God. Therefore, Rumi views petitionary prayer ultimate aim as elevating the petitioner toward love prayer. While petitionary prayer originates in human need, love prayer finds its essence in transcendence of need. This raises the very important question: how can one attain such freedom from need? Rumi locates the answer in the virtue of rida, contentment, quietism, a spiritual state wherein the seeker liberates himself from both fear and grief, surrendering his will completely to the divine will. Rumi tells a story of a laughing dervish who was quite content and happy. Someone asked him the secret to his happiness. Why are you so happy? The dervish responds as follows, quote, he said, how should that one be according to whose desire the work of the world goes on? Everything happens according to my will. According to whose desire the torrents and rivers flow, and the stars move in such wise as he wills. And life and death are his officers, going to and fro according to his desire. Says, of course I'm happy. Everything happens according to my wish. The man asked the dervish, how is it possible that everything happens according to your will? And he responded, here's this much, however, since all action in the universe only comes to pass by the command of the Maker, that is God, when the predestination of God becomes the pleasure of his servant, he, that is the servant, becomes a willing slave to his decree. The servant of God, whose disposition and character is like this, does not the world move around according to his command and behest? End of the quote. So ultimately said, I'm in a state that I submitted my will to God. I'm so happy to, embrace whatever comes from God. Therefore, since everything in this universe happens according to God's will, it is as if it happens according to my will, and therefore I'm happy. There is no reason for resentment and unhappiness. So when an individual transcends fear and grief, they attain the capacity to seek God purely for his own sake. Love prayer then emerges as a sacred dialogue between lover, the devotee, and the beloved, the divine, grounded not in need and necessity, but in passionate devotion. This profound intimacy approaches the realm of divine revelation, exemplified by Moses' second level of communication with God in the holy valley of Tova, where conversation served solely as an expression of joyful companionship. Thus, the spiritual journey progresses from need-based petitionary prayer to the sublime state of love prayer, where the soul's singular need is nothing but God's presence. However, Rumi maintains that even love prayer, while representing an advanced spiritual state, does not constitute the most perfect form of divine communion. In his relational mode, traces of Sufi's ego persist. The desire for God, however sublime, still implies a separate desiring self. The I-thou dynamic of lover in the love prayer necessarily preserve dualistic consciousness. True perfection for Rumi requires complete ontological or at least experiential unity, what in Sufi's literature calls fana, wherein all distinction dissolves in divine singularity. This represents the ultimate prayer, the prayer of the annihilated self, where only God remains. As previously mentioned, love prayer maintains an inherent subject-object dichotomy between the worshipper I and the divine thou. Rumi and other Islamic mystics posit that the seeker must ultimately transcend this duality through complete self-annihilation. In this supreme state, the Sufi not only surrenders volition to divine will, but moves beyond even that contentment of earlier stage to achieve full ontological dissolution. Rumi describes a mystical elite, God's closest allies, who attain such complete union that transcend conventional prayer altogether. These perfected beings, according to Rumi, exist in a state of constant where formal supplication becomes superfluous. These perfected mystics regarded conventional prayer as an impertinence and presumptuous interference in divine providence. Quote, Rumi says, "I know another class of saints whose mouths are closed to invocation." They don't pray. Because of the content that is subservient to possessed by those noble ones, it has become unlawful for them to seek to avert destiny. In submitting to destiny, they experience a peculiar delight. It would be an act of infidelity for them to crave release. They accepted everything from God, and they think it is a kind of blasphemy if you ask God to avert his decision, to change it. Rumi recounts the story of a pious mystic named Daghoughî, who sought companionship with saints. Upon encountering a group of perfected saints, they invited him, Daghoughî, to lead them in salat, a ritual prayer. During the prayer, Daghoughî, in his vision, perceived a ship in peril. Its passenger overcome with terror amidst turbulent waves. Moved by compassion, he interrupted the prayer to supplicate for their deliverance. When the ship was saved, the saint began murmuring in disapproval, asking, "Who is this meddler?" Upon discovering Daghoughî's intercession, they immediately vanished. Their disappearance signified, profound disapproval. For these saints, Daghoughî's petition demonstrated both a lack of complete trust in divine providence and an inappropriate interference in God's autonomous governance of creation. Rumi describes the prayer in this state of self-annihilation as God's self-communion. The divine serves as both the source and the recipient of supplication, calling upon and responding to himself. In its most perfect manifestation, prayer transcends verbal articulation altogether, becoming a pure silent, a pure presence, where distinction between whisperer and worship dissolves entirely. There is no distinction between self and God. That wall between them disappears, like a drop of water that joins ocean. What remains is nothing but the ocean. At this level, the prayer means the ocean, calls upon itself and it responds to itself. Rumi, quote, "That unconscious invocation is in truth different. That invocation is not from him, the speaker. It is spoken by the divine judge. God is making that invocation, since he, the speaker, is nodded, annihilated. The invocation and the answer to it are both from God. For the prayer of a sheikh, the spiritual director, is not like every prayer. He is nodded, annihilated, and his words are the words of God. Since God asks and begs of himself, how then should he refuse to grant his own prayer?" Thank you very much. Is there any Q&A? Any comment from the audience?
Yes.
Sure, very good.
So, thank you very much for your lecture and all these fruitful insights into the Islamic Sufi tradition. Wir verabschieden uns jetzt von denen, die online zugeschaltet sind und werden eine Zeit für Fragen. We will now have the time for question and answer. So please feel free to the audience.